Hey, our next guest has an interesting theory. I'm going to pick his brain about this. I'm not saying that I necessarily disagree with it. It's quite provocative, and we'll get into it. His book is called Freedom Nationally, Virtue Locally, or Socialism. Kevin Miller is on the line with us. And Kevin, how are you?
I'm doing great, Phil. Thanks for having me on.
My pleasure. Now, let me see if I've got this straight, and you tell me if I don't, and we'll get into the discussion of it. You're saying that if we have freedom nationally and national virtue, i.e., if conservative Christians get their way of legislating things from the federal level, that we're going to turn into a socialist country. And I guess an example would be internet regulation. If the conservative Christians had their way, we would do away with pornography and all of this nastiness on the internet, but we would be regulated by the government. Is that what you're saying?
Well, that's particularly one example that might happen. I'm speaking more broadly. It isn't just about the Christians that are the problem. I don't think that the federal government's in any position to define virtue properly, nor to deliver virtue properly, whether it's a social conservative brand of virtue or a liberal form of virtue. In fact, constitutionally, I don't think we're set up that way. The virtue is supposed to be local, meaning in our families, in our churches, in our communities, in our workplaces, and so designed constitutionally. It makes loads of sense. It's the way our framers wanted it to be. Anytime we turn over federal virtues to the federal government, it gets distorted. They're not qualified to do it. They don't deliver it properly. No matter what its beginning intentions are, whether it's social conservatism or liberalism.
So we're talking about like all this social justice that the liberals talk about is their way of being virtuous on a federal level, but it'll lead to socialism.
No, absolutely correct. They dream up. In fact, as you read the book, I say there is no definition of social justice. So whatever the liberals want to define as social justice, they put it into a program, and we all end up having to conform to the federal government's vision of virtue. That's true in social justice. That's true in environmentalism. And our problem strategically on the conservative side is we do want a virtuous country. Pretty much everybody does. The problem is that we should never agree that the federal government is the agency by which you define and deliver virtue. We need to say freedom nationally. The federal government's high purpose is to deliver and sustain our freedom, and then it's virtue locally. And that may mean something different in Berkeley than it does in Colorado Springs. It means something different in an Amish community than it does in Las Vegas.
Do you mean when you say virtue locally, are you talking about through the government or just through the local people?
Well, it's a combination. I'm really referring constitutionally. It can be at the state level. That's not my particular preference. My preference, as I write in the book, is that it cascades down. It's first at the individual and family and community level. And there's every reason for a community to want to have virtue locally. For example, they don't want to have a strip club next to their elementary school. That's eminently reasonable. And that's what a community concern is about, and they ought to be able to define virtue locally.
But in Berkeley, they may want to have a strip club in the elementary school. So that's,
Exactly correct. And that would line right up with the Obama administration wanting to teach sex ed to sixth graders, or to 6-year-olds.
Yeah, just bring them in and show them right there. Bring the brass pole in, the whole 9 yards.
Absolutely. I'm not agreeing that Berkeley should have strip clubs in the elementary school. Of course,
you're just saying it's up to Berkeley.
It's up to Berkeley.
Right.
That's exactly what happens. And Phil, that's what's happened before 380 years ago when the Puritans were handling their church a particular way, and Roger Williams left and founded Providence, Rhode Island. And the Quakers were in Pennsylvania.
That's right.
It's always been about virtue locally, and we should go out and fight for virtue locally in our families, in our communities, in our churches, but we should never give the definition and enforcement of virtue to the federal government.
Well, see, that's where I come down on this whole gay marriage thing. I mean, if they want to have gay marriage in Vermont, that's what the individual states were set up to do, is for like-minded people to be able to congregate in an area where they want to congregate. And if they want to have gay marriage in Vermont, they have gay marriage in Vermont. Doesn't mean that we have to have it everywhere else. And we don't have to recognize it everywhere else either.
That's a principle I'm shooting for here. And there's a reason Massachusetts is liberal and Texas is conservative, and it thrives that way. And quite frankly, I'm a serious Christian. If I don't particularly care for that, whether it's gay marriage in Vermont or liberalism in Massachusetts, I have a couple of choices. I can move to a different state, or I can fight by witness and by voice for more conservative values in Massachusetts or Vermont. It's actually what makes the country able to thrive, and it's frankly for a Christian, that's a target market if that's the way they want to look at it. What I'm really looking for in the final analysis is this. We've agreed tacitly, unfortunately in politics, through social conservatism sometimes, Christian conservatism, of which I am, I plead guilty, we've agreed that the government is supposed to define, the federal government is supposed to define and deliver virtue. That is not possible. In fact, I have a statement in the book that's very blunt. When Americans ask the federal government to deliver both freedom and virtue, they will ultimately get neither, because the federal government will misdefine virtue. They'll apply it like environmentalism and teaching sex to our 6-year-olds, and that we will lose our freedoms while they're busy trying to define virtue properly. That's the path we've been on for 50 years.
Well, and I think people don't recognize that because they think that whoever's in power now, if it's, like when George Bush was in power, they wanted George Bush to do all sorts of things that I didn't think that he should be doing constitutionally as a president. But then when we have somebody else in there that, you got to be careful what kind of bed you lay or what kind of rights you instill with the federal government, because the new people coming in will take that and twist it into something else, and so we got to be very careful about that.
Phil, that's precisely right. Let's just take his White House office on faith-based and community initiatives. That was he didn't need to put that program in place. He intended it to have conservative virtues to be awarded to those types of conservative institutions like churches. And guess what? When the next administration comes in, they institutionalize it to something completely different.
That's right.
We don't need, social conservatism doesn't work from the top down anyway. For social conservatives, they know how social conservatism works. It works in your neighborhood. It works in your family. It works in your local school where we shouldn't have the Department of Education in it. It doesn't work when an unaccountable bureaucrat decides from several thousand miles away what's good for 300 million Americans and change everyone's virtue all at once.
Yeah, I mean,
that's what we've been living with.
That's right, and we've got this No Child Left Behind thing. A lot of people were applauding, saying that's wonderful. I said it was fine in theory, but the federal government had no business deciding this. And now on the heels of that, we got Michelle Obama and her husband are now deciding what your kid's going to eat in your local school. And, of course, the door was kicked wide open by No Child Left Behind. Once the government could get in and decide a curriculum, then why on earth would they not be able to decide the menu at the school lunch? So I think Bush kicked that door open and Obama walked right in.
See, that's the problem we're having, and I see the social conservatives that are listening to you right now, Phil, and that is you have the right goal in mind. We do. You and I share that goal. That is, we want to have freedom nationally, and we want to have virtue where we live. The problem is our strategy has been wrong in conservatism, frankly, for about 80 years. Once the federal government started defining virtues, we said, well, we know what virtue is. We started trying to compete, as you said, from administration to administration for whose virtue wins at the federal level. We were never intended to have virtue defined at the federal level. It's a local matter. And that may be a state. There are all kinds of reasons why Massachusetts is liberal and Texas is conservative. But there are reasons why some particular state may override a community's values, like California may override what Berkeley does because of spillover costs of marijuana laws, for example. So I'm not saying it's not messy to do virtue locally. What I am saying quite clearly is this. When you ask the federal government to define and deliver virtue, you will never get virtue, and you will lose your freedom in the bargain. And that's been our story for about 50 years. What I'm really looking for is for people who cherish freedom, and there are tens of millions of them in America, to bind together and say, look, it is about freedom nationally. We don't want any virtues coming from Washington because they'll never end up being virtuous. And we're going to fight for that freedom. And yes, you and I, Phil, we may live in the same town, like say Nashville. We may agree on freedom nationally, and we'll probably disagree what virtue locally looks like. We may be allies at the federal level, but but we may disagree about how it works in the city of Nashville. That's okay. Let the people who live in Nashville decide that, or the state of Tennessee decide that, because that's the only rational way to approach it.
Yeah, and we've seen that even in the big cities, like and Nashville has gotten more and more this way too. It's become a blue city and a sea of red, and all the surrounding counties are very conservative, and Nashville itself has gone very liberal, and the liberals have taken over, and the rest of us have started to move out, and I don't think anybody's really complaining about it either way. Although I see the city going down and down in many ways, but it's a local thing now. If in the county and the city I live in, I moved outside of Nashville, we can do our own thing.
It's inevitable that happens. I mean, that's the way human nature is. When people move in and they adopt a certain set of and change to a new set of values in a mobile society like we have, others move to an area that's more congenial to their goals,
right.
Whether it's how the schools look. There's nothing wrong with that per se. That's the way it should be. That's the freedom we enjoy, to have the mobility to go move to where our values are. And if we're Christians, I speak to my Christian friend, and we don't like what's going on in the city, we'll move there and be a missionary. That's great. Change them with the freedom of religion that you have, the freedom of speech, the freedom of press, and change the cities you don't like. Don't do it by fiat from the federal government, because, quite frankly, social conservatism will never win out at the federal level. It's not what the federal government is about. The federal government is about expanding its control over people's lives and expanding their influence. We need to stop that faulty strategy. Agree that what we want is freedom nationally and virtue locally across all kinds of political spectrums, from Tea Party to conservative Christian to libertarians to Christian conservatives, and say, we do agree this: the federal government should not be the virtue provider, the virtue definer. We agree on that. Now we'll then look at our individual cities and states and work it out there.
It's the book is called Freedom Nationally, Virtue Locally, or Socialism by Kevin Miller. I'm holding up for the TV audience here, Kevin, so they can see this. And I've got now a new title: Conservative Missionary. That's what I'm going to be. And so I'll have to go to all these blue cities and blue states and spread the good word.
Thanks, Bill. Hey, one thing I must say is, I define it here. People refer to why do I call it socialism? Well, what's happened is the federal government has moved us they moved us beyond economic socialism, which is leveling of our finances, to virtue socialism, which is leveling our virtues to whatever the feds say.
Right.
Go back to what we eat with your Michelle Obama story, to what age our kids get exposed to public school sex education, to whether we can buy light bulbs that we want. It's a leveling of virtues, and it's not an improvement.
Well, you make some great points, Kevin. Appreciate it. I urge everybody to get a hold of this book, Freedom Nationally, Virtue Locally, or Socialism. Kevin Miller. Appreciate it, Kevin.
Phil, thanks so much for your time. I appreciate it so much.
My pleasure. Quick time out. We're going to be back in a moment. 1-800-618-PHIL. Stay with us.
You're listening to The Phil Valentine Show on Westwood One.